my moves like my ABCs.
Here's a fun idea. Let's talk about abortion. Let's leave all those religious arguments all to one side because they're completely irrelevant. There's no evidence for a soul or anything like that. It's all completely pointless, and we live in secular nations where this is simply not a factor. So, fuck all that shit. If you're going to argue against abortion, you need a good, strong, secular, scientific argument. And there aren't any. But it's alive. So what? Animals are alive. We eat them. Viruses and bacteria are alive. We eradicate them for our better good. A gangrenous limb is still, for the time being, alive, and we amputate it. A mangled limb at a car crash. We get rid of it. An infected organ. Shh, cut it out. No problem. So, alive. No, not a good argument. Oh, but it's human. Cancerous tissue is human. The aforementioned limbs are human. The aforementioned organs are human. No, this is simply not a good argument. You know, we cut off mastectomies. We cut off, bits of breasts and so on to remove them or reduce them, and no one cares. So human tissue, this is irrelevant. It's not a good argument. It's not a good metric. If we say, oh, we can't harm anything human, then we can't save people from cancer or numerous other issues. So no, that's not a good metric at all either. You want to go by heartbeat. Well, there's conditions where people can be born completely without brains, only having the brain stem and the spine. And that autonomic nervous system will keep a heart beating in spite of there's no person there. There is no personality, there is no intelligence, there is no capacity for memory or personhood whatsoever, and yet there will be a heart beating. We can artificially create heart tissue in the lab and have it beating, just independently. You can hook up a heart that's been taken from a body to electrical stimulus, and it will beat. This is no indication of humanity or personhood or anything important. But okay, let's leave that aside for one moment, because you concede something when you say it's the heartbeat that matters. That means what prior to the heartbeat existing, which is around after 6 weeks. So you saying prior to the heart beating, it doesn't prick your conscience. It doesn't give you an issue prior to that point. Are you saying abortion is okay up until the point that there's a heart beating? Because that's an important concession. That means that you're setting a line after which you believe that this is now a life worth saving, and you're setting it at the heartbeat. Well, good news. Depending on the country that you're in, a third to half of abortions already take place in that period, so you should have no issue. Sound fair? But then, as it turns out, heartbeat is no good metric either anyway, as I've just covered, but it is an important concession on your part. So what is a good metric then? What makes us us? What defines us as a person? Our personality, our capacity to learn, our memory, our experience, our perception of the world, our consciousness. That's what makes a person a person. That is what is worth saving. That is what's meaningful, not this crude matter. This doesn't matter. If there was a way to have a disembodied consciousness, that would be what would be worth saving, or transferring, or putting into a new body, or whatever else. But that's getting into science fiction territory. But the point is that what makes us us exists in this pudding inside our skull. Yeah? And for a great deal of a fetus's development, this doesn't really do anything. A few automatic functions turn up, and this is where you get arguments about fetal pain, and where you get arguments about reaction. Oh, the fetus moves and it reacts to stimulus. You don't need a conscious brain to react to stimulus. Going back to the earlier thing I was talking about with bodies that are born without brains, you can still get reflex from some of them. They can still react to pain, but they're not perceiving pain. Right? It's just an automatic reaction. So this gives us a useful bar that we can actually set. If we can say that what makes a person is consciousness, is personality, the capacity for memory, the capacity to learn and develop and grow and experience and perceive, then if we can find out when that comes about, then we can set a line. We can say, this is the point at which the flesh becomes a person, the operating system installed on the computer, without which it's just a jumble of parts. Yeah? So can we find that out? Can we determine when consciousness comes about? Well, as it turns out, we can. Advances in encephalographs, MRIs, fMRIs have allowed us to scan the brains of fetuses as they're in development and to determine what kind of activity is going on in the brains. We also have some idea of which parts of the brain determine consciousness, because if you damage them and harm them, then you can harm awareness, self-awareness, perception, all of that. So we have an idea of what consciousness is, or at least what parts of the brain are involved in it. And if those parts of the brain are not active, then you do not have consciousness. So when we scan fetal brains, what we find is these areas of the brain do not start functioning at all until about 20 weeks and are not constantly on and operating until about 24 weeks, which is in the UK is the current sort of upper limit of non-medical abortion. So there is no person in this flesh, we can fairly safely say, until at least 20 weeks, and that's being incredibly safe. Okay, so we can say without doubt that nothing significant or important, no person is being harmed or potentially harmed until at least the 20-week mark. And good news, the vast and overwhelming majority of abortions take place well before that. Before 13 weeks, it's nearly 90% or so, at least in the UK, take place prior to 13 weeks or prior. Okay? And those that take place after are almost all medical abortions. And those are done for the sake of the mother. So at that point, it's a cost benefit, really. You know, who stands to benefit more from being alive, if it comes down, because that's the kind of question it generally comes down to, you know, whose betterment is served at that point, and that's down to individual circumstances, so we can't really comment on that, but we can say that prior to 20 weeks, probably later, there is no person being lost at this point. So there is really no rational ethical dilemma prior to 20 weeks in having an abortion. And that's when most of them take place. So the only good metric that we have, the only one that applies, is consciousness. And there is no chance of consciousness, so far as medical science is able to tell at this point, prior to 20 weeks. So barring some kind of other scientific revelation, that's pretty much it, so far as the scientific argument focused on the fetus and the mother is concerned. There are social arguments and things as well, but that's beyond the scope of this video. So I would normally just stop there, but people do make a stupid mistake that I just want to cover quickly to stem the tide a little. Right, when I'm talking about consciousness, I'm talking about the quality of personhood, of perception, of awareness, you know, of knowing that you exist and experiencing, not the act of being conscious as in being awake, right? So if you say, oh, well, that means you'd be happy killing someone who's asleep or who has been knocked out or is in a coma or whatever, then you're being a fuckwit. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about consciousness, the quality of personhood and of awareness. All right? When you go to sleep, you dream, and you're going to wake up again. Yeah? It's not the same. You've had consciousness, you retain attenuated awareness while you're asleep, and then you're awake again and you're fully conscious again. You retain your memories and experiences and personality and everything else. Okay? A fetus, up until 20 plus weeks, has never had consciousness. Alright? Up until that brain section boots up, there's never been a consciousness. It's no different to a severed hand or whatever else, except in its potential. Okay? So we're not talking about conscious, as in the opposite of unconscious. We're talking about consciousness, as opposed to being inanimate or insensate. Right? It's the difference between a human being and a rock. Okay, so please don't make that argument. It just makes you look like an idiot. I understand that the English language is not necessarily precise in these kind of areas, but it's a difference between consciousness and conscious, and please understand that. So yeah, if people want, I can touch on the social and societal arguments that people make about this in another video, but I just wanted to make a purely secular scientific argument that there is no ethical or moral dilemma in abortion prior to 20 weeks. After that, I can see how there will be argument. Personally speaking, here is what I would do if I was in charge of the government. I would say that 20 weeks or prior, anyone can get an abortion, no problem, no issue. On the NHS, absolutely no issue whatsoever. There should be no question. You want one, you get one. That's it. End of story. Though I would encourage contraception over that. After 20 weeks, I think you have to weigh the needs of the mother versus the needs of the child, because at that point you have a consciousness, you have a person, there is something actually being lost at that point. And so after 20 weeks, I would restrict it to medical abortion. Now, medical abortions include psychological issues. And here I think some people who have concerns do have a point, because mental health diagnoses are difficult, very easily abusable, though I doubt many people would go to that length. So I think being more cautious when it's a psychological illness, it is worthwhile. There's also some argument earlier on over when the capacity to feel pain, exactly when that develops, and depends what you mean by the capacity to feel pain. So even earlier than 20 weeks, I would suggest that a fetus be anaesthetized when performing an abortion. I can't remember offhand exactly when the development stage is that the whole pain system is hooked up, but it does happen before consciousness comes up. So again, erring on the side of caution, anaesthetize the fetus even before the conscious stage, if an abortion has to take place. So that's where I'd be, and I think that is a position that is backed by the science. The social arguments, those are other ones. If people want me to do a follow-up video on the social arguments, happy to. Peace out.